Well, that's a question that has been studied for almost a century. There's an idea, it's called somehow called the Whorf hypothesis, Benjamin Lee Whorf, which is that your language determines the way you perceive and understand the world. And sounds plausible on the surface, but it's been very hard to find any experimental evidence for it, except in very superficial ways. So, for example, there are languages that draw the color spectrum is divided somewhat differently, not totally differently, in different languages. So some languages don't have a distinction between orange and red, let's say. They just use the same word for both orange and red. And it turns out if you do perceptual experiments and you present people with a stimulus that's on the red-orange border, close to one or close, turns out that if you ask them later what they saw, people in a language like ours, which distinguishes them, will remember better what they saw than people with no distinction. But that's almost trivial. When we saw something that was red, we coded in our minds as red, so we'll remember. But who cares? But it's hard to find anything much beyond that. There's been a lot of efforts, and there is debate and discussion about it. So it's not a settled question by any means. But for things like perception and so on, very little evidence. What about beyond that? Do people have a different conception of one of the early proposals that was by Whorf himself, which was considered very significant? He was studying the Hopi language and culture, and he argued that they have a different conception of time. All of us think of time as kind of like a line, with ourselves standing at one point on the line, looking forward to the future, looking backward to the past. He argued that the Hopi don't think of it that way because they don't have past, present, and future in their language. They think about it in some relativistic terms and so on. Problem with that proposal is that English doesn't have past, present, and future. We don't have future tense in English. If you want to talk about the future, you use what's called a modal word, like will or shall, which is just one of a class of modals. May, might, can, will, shall. So if you apply his reasoning, we shouldn't have the conception that we do have. And as far as we know, that Hopi have the same conception. So that just collapsed, and other efforts have been made, and they haven't been very successful. When we get to your point, social and political consequences, it's very hard to find anything. It's even for simple perceptual things, it's hard. There's a lot of loose talk about these topics, but when you look into them, the arguments don't make much sense, and it's very hard to find evidence. But I don't think there's any particular reason that we know of to think that there are social and political consequences to the language that we use. We could have totally different languages and have the same social political systems. In fact, that's true to an extent. Take the United States. There are people whose first language is different. Take my parents, for example. My father grew up in the Ukraine. His first language was Yiddish. It's the language of Jews in the Ukraine, Eastern Europe. But he had the same, he came to the United States when he was 17. So he's already grown. But he had the same he lived in the United States the same way anybody else did. I'm sure you know people who have immigrant backgrounds who have different, whose native language is different, but they live in the same society we do.